This is episode number 162.
Today, we're featuring art historian and author Letsinger-Miller.
This is the PleinAir Podcast with Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of PleinAir magazine. In the PleinAir Podcast, we cover the world of outdoor painting. Called PleinAir, the French coined the term, which means open air or outdoors. The French pronounce it plein air. Others say plain air. No matter how you say it, there is a huge movement of artists around the world who are going outdoors to paint. And this show is about that movement. Now, here's your host, author, publisher, and painter, Eric Rhodes.
Thank you, Jim Kipping, and welcome to the PleinAir Podcast. My name is Eric, and, well, hello from Russia. Yes, you heard right. I'm working this week and next week in Russia. I'm here doing several projects. No, I'm not here to buy or influence any elections. I won't be running for office anytime soon. Or ever, but I am here shooting an art instruction video with the famous Russian master Nikolai Blokhin. As you know, or maybe you don't know, the Russian training system is considered the best training system in the world for artists. Always has been. And as a result, these people are super trained. And Nikolai Blokhin, whose art sells for literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, was a top professor at the Repin Institute of the Russian Academy of Art, which was created by Catherine the Great. And he's considered one of the great instructors. So I'm doing an art instruction video with him, one on painting and one on drawing. And I'm also working on a documentary while I'm in the area. So I'm in Moscow later in the week. I'm in St. Petersburg right now. And I'll be interviewing the director, if you will, of the Repin Institute, also the director of the Serikov Institute in Moscow. And I'm interviewing the director of the Hermitage, the greatest museum in the world, who's a friend of mine. Also, the director of the Tretyakov Museum, the great Russian museum in Moscow. And also several other art historians and artists. And so it's a crazy busy time. I'm also painting. I've been painting by myself when I can slip out and painting some Russian masters. And yes, it's been pretty cold, pretty unbelievably cold, but I got these big, thick boots, and they say that vodka keeps you warm, but I haven't dipped into that yet. Anyway, I'm also going to be going inland after I leave here, going inland to explore some areas that I'll be taking you in my September 2021 Russian painting trip. It's going to be a busy couple of weeks because I'm doing site selections, going to places, hotels, checking them out, checking out the food. And of course, in the midst of all that, I have to do things like this too, and do my work and check my email. So it's kind of a crazy time. I hope you'll find today's subject of interest. This is about an art colony that became quite important in the art world, with our interview coming up in a minute. A reminder that the PleinAir Salon is in its last bi-monthly round, and it's coming up on March 15th. And we end the annual competition. Everybody who's won the bi-monthly competitions is entered into the judging for the final. So there's 20 categories. Everybody who wins in a category gets into the judging. And there are all kinds of categories. Not everything is plein air. But you need to enter by March 15th, and that's the last chance. And then we're going to do the big prize award giveaway, $15,000 cash plus more cash at the PleinAir convention. So just go to pleinairsalon.com. I also want to mention that many of us are not only plein air and landscape painters, but we're also figure and portrait painters. And what I have found and what others have told me is that figure painting makes you a better plein air painter, just like plein air painting makes you a better figure painter. So we created a conference very much like the PleinAir convention. It's called FACE. PleinAir convention is PACE, right? So this is FACE, the Figurative Art Convention and Expo. And it's going to be in Baltimore in October. As a matter of fact, on Halloween, we're having a big artist party. You dress up like artists. It's going to be a lot of fun. Anyway, it's like the convention in the sense it's got great masters who are coming in to teach. And we have Rose Franson this year and Juliet Aristides and the incredible Mary White, the watercolorist. and many, many, many more. And the conference is going to just be a blowout blast. It's a lot of fun, top masters, and then several stages, and you can practice what you learned in the studio. Like the PleinAir convention where we go outside to paint, we have a studio with live models that you can opt into, and it's the world's largest studio, and usually about a dozen or more models, depending on how big the convention gets. So you can learn more by visiting figurativeartconvention.com. I also want to mention that every year I take a group of artists and art collectors on a trip to Europe to see art from behind the scenes. Man, I love my life. Anyway, we go to museums, sometimes private homes, private collections, art studios, meet with artists, meet with top historians, etc. This fall, we're going to go all out in Austria and Germany, especially focusing on Vienna. We could easily spend 5 days in Vienna just getting behind the scenes and all the art. And of course, we do some other things too, which is fun. And also Berlin. And Berlin has some absolutely amazing art things going on, so you don't want to miss this. Anyway, you can learn more about that at finearttrip.com. Coming up after my interview, I'll be answering art marketing questions in the Art Marketing Minute, not meeting. Let's get right to the interview with art historian Lynn Letsinger-Miller. Well, Lynn Letsinger-Miller, welcome to the PleinAir Podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, this is a little bit of a departure from what we normally do. We spend most of our time interviewing artists, but today we're doing something a little bit different. Lynn is an art historian and an author and has spent a lot of time in and around and studying the artists of Brown County, Indiana, which is a very significant movement we're going to talk about today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So before we started recording, you and I were chatting about our backgrounds in Indiana, and you started to tell me how you got interested in this idea of art in Brown County. How did that happen?
Well, I was working as a television reporter in Fort Wayne, actually, is where things sort of began. And as everybody was furnishing their apartments, I began to venture over to the Fort Wayne Art School and began buying paintings by the original artists. And so I kind of developed an interest in art and artists. And then you sort of fast forward 15, 20 years later, I ended up working in Indianapolis. I was married, and my husband and I got a log cabin home in Brown County. And I knew that there was some art there, but we were involved in a lot of other things. But my neighbor happened to have a huge collection of Brown County paintings, and another neighbor was an art dealer and was the executive director of the Brown County Art Guild. So through those people, I really developed an appreciation for the art, and I learned a lot about the business of art from my neighbor who was a dealer. So in my spare time, I would volunteer for different events, particularly at the Brown County Art Gallery, which at the time really needed volunteers. And they had a large permanent collection, and eventually, I took a little part-time job at the paper when I stopped working in TV, and I was teaching at IU, and I began writing articles about the early colony. And I met a lot of people in town who knew many of the early artists, and so it was my friend from the Guild, Margaret Colglazier, said, we need to have a book about the Brown County art colony. And so I put together a proposal. We went to IU Press, and I sort of found myself in the position of, oh my gosh, now I have to write this thing. And so that really kind of put me in the thick of it as far as learning a lot. I've been writing articles, and I knew it was a really good story just from it was just kind of a romantic story, a lot of interesting people in this early backwoods area. But then when you spend a lot of time talking with collectors in particular who have not only buy the art, but really, really go in depth in the history and want to know every little nuance about the painting that they bought, and then just going through the records and things at the art gallery, which had been founded in 1926. So that's really kind of what started me off on all of this.
So before we launch into this, and I think that people are going to actually find this fascinating, there is such a rich history of plein air painting in this part of Indiana. And at the time, there were several colonies that had kind of cropped up across America. The Laguna colony, there was a colony in Connecticut, J. Alden Weir's place. There was the Brown County and Taos painters, et cetera. There were several. And so we're going to get into this, but I want to ask you a couple of questions from the perspective of an author and what you have to say to living artists today who will one day need to be documented and one day need to be written about in their books. So what are the things that you wish you had on the backs of paintings? What kind of documentation do you wish these artists had done? What would have made learning about them and writing about them much easier?
Signing and dating them would have been a great start. It's amazing how many big collections of art have pieces that are not signed, and then not dated. And that's just always the first question you get from, a visitor or a collector is, when was this painted? And you really just can only stand back and look at, well, what do the trees look like? How are the people dressed? Trying to find clues that might point to that. I don't know. On the back of the painting, you certainly would like to have, stickers or wherever it had been exhibited, and every time it changes hands, or even an envelope that, gives a little detail on the part of the artist. I painted this in this location, and this was why I was attracted to it. And sometimes a painting does have a little story with it. There's one artist living now, Ken Buckler, who draws a map on the back of his paintings showing exactly where he painted it, which I find really fascinating. And so, anything that can lend to a provenance, I think a buyer, appreciates, and then later down the road, so will somebody trying to sort out your story.
I've heard some galleries, not all, say that they don't want a painting dated at least on the front because they want to have something that appears fresh, and sometimes if something sits for 2 or 3 years and doesn't sell, it doesn't appear fresh. Do you have an opinion about that?
Well, I guess, if you're looking at a contemporary artist, I guess that makes sense. My area of expertise in terms of working as a dealer, which I did do, and I do assist with the art gallery with that, is, I'm looking at historic pieces, early art, and so the dates are essential. But I don't know. I think if something's good, it's good. and it's just a piece of information that goes with it. I guess if it's on the back, it's equally as useful.
I was on Facebook the other day, and somebody had posted a picture of a painting and a signature, and they were trying to figure out who it was that had signed it. Because it was somebody whose collection, someone who had passed away, their collection, they were trying to figure out what to do with the collection. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because everybody has their signatures, but signatures are oftentimes not clear.
Yes, that's certainly the truth. Maybe you could print your name on the back. Just like when you sign most documents, they ask for a printed name as well. And artists might think about that when they sign.
I have, in my art marketing boot camps, I talk a lot about the importance of the back of the painting and how the back of the painting needs to become a living document, because I think that, first off, I don't always do this myself, but I like to tell the stories. I was with this painter or that painter, we were painting in this location. I've even suggested that we start putting GPS coordinates. You can find them in your phone. There's an app you can find out the GPS coordinates so that somebody could actually go to that location 100 years from now, where there might be an apartment building standing, and go, oh, this is what this used to look like back then.
I'm sure there will be some writers in their future who will thank you.
Well, let's talk about the Brown County artist, and let's help us understand the significance of this movement?
Well, I think the best way to think about them is that they're kind of the second generation of the plein air painters. Those who preceded them actually, studied in Europe and became very fascinated with the French Impressionists. And they came back to the United States, and so now, and either were working or became friends with other artists who got really interested in what was happening, and more artists went over there to study. And so I think, probably the key place that where a lot of the artists came from, or at least were influenced by, what was Chicago with the Art Institute, because a lot had come there from other places. Many had studied in Europe and so forth, and they kind of began talking amongst each other about Brown County. There was T.C. Steele, who was probably Indiana's most well-known artist, had a very long career as a portrait painter, had studied in Europe and came back and worked for a number of years in Brookville and had studios elsewhere. And eventually, kind of at midlife, his wife had died. He'd married a younger woman. He decided to buy 200 acres in Brown County in a little town near Belmont, which was located between Nashville and Bloomington, and he actually worked as IU's first artist in residence. And so he began building a house there, and you have to understand that Indiana, Brown County in 1900 was Indiana 1840, very primitive, and people living in log cabins and no running water or electricity, and it had been heavily timbered. So Steele could stand on a hill in his property and see for miles, and so this was really intriguing to him. And, but yet you were close to markets. You were near Indianapolis, you were near Bloomington, you were near Louisville. You could get to Chicago. And then the train came into Helmsburg. They didn't want it in Nashville. They didn't want that sneaky train coming to town.
Nashville,
so it
Indiana.
ended up in yes, Nashville, Indiana. That was the county seat. And so it landed in Helmsburg. And you had to take a carriage or walk 7 miles into town. One interesting thing that sort of happened is Steele was known to the son of an industrialist in Indianapolis named Fred Hetherington. And once the train became available, Fred took the train down, and he had met Steele at Heron, the art school in Indianapolis, and he came to see his house being built. And he was from a family of wealth. He wasn't real interested in the family business, which I think was bridge building or something. And he decided he wanted a cabin. So about 1908, just a year after Steele started his, he bought a little cabin just north of town. And he named it the Emmylou Ranch after his wife. And he began inviting people from the Chicago Palette and Chisel Club to visit him in his cabin, and they would come on the train. And there were some articles written out, some artists who came down and went back and talked to a reporter in the Chicago papers up there, and some stories began generating about this wonderful rustic place where this famous artist was painting and how it had, such charm. And so I think a lot through Fred Hetherington, who invited these people down. They would stay, and it just one person invited another, and pretty soon you had a core of people kind of filtering through, at one time or another, the Art Institute, but also all over Cincinnati and Houston and certainly New York, the Artist Students League, and one thing kind of led to the next, and finally a man named Adolf Schultz, who was from Wisconsin. He had met his wife, who was from Terre Haute, Ada Walter Schultz, also a very well-known artist in her own right. And they were living in Delavan, Wisconsin, and they thought it was all too touristy. And when they were visiting the Art Institute, they learned about Brown County, so Schultz came down on his own. And it was a little too rustic at the time, he thought, for his wife and young son, but he was really impressed with the place, and he wrote an article, and he describes this painter's fairyland with Queen Anne's lace and people hidden in these cabins, and it just sort of added to the romance of it. And eventually a man named Bill Pittman bought the sanitarium and turned it into a hotel, Pittman's Inn, and it had big wide porches. And so the artists would come and they would stay in Pittman's Inn, and they would tromp out into the landscape area, out into the woods or down Greasy Creek or all the different roads, and paint, and then come back in the evenings and kind of sit on the porch and share ideas and techniques, and they would have dinner there. One of the more famous people who came was Gustav Bellman, woodcut artist. You mentioned Taos. He ended up in Santa Fe.
I was going to ask you about Bellman because I was flipping through your book, and Bellman is probably the most famous of internationally known artists. Obviously, Steele is very well known, but really well known in Indiana, not as much nationally. But Bellman, very collectible, very desirable part of that whole Taos thing. Did he actually live in Brown County?
Well, he rode the train. He decided to go on a vacation, and he'd read about Brown County, so he wanted to see what it was all about. So he got on the train, and he sat next to Fred Hetherington, who said, "Gosh, I happen to have a cabin in Brown County. Why don't you come and stay with me?" And this was in 1910. And Fred kept a guest book, but it was really elaborate. It was called the Emmylou Ranch Book, and everyone who stayed there not only signed it, but they did sketches, and they wrote little notes, and they talked about the dinner parties and who cooked and who washed the dishes, and they had pictures of wine glasses, and we actually owned that book. It was donated to us from a collector just this year. It's a real treasure. And so, you see members of the Hoosier group, that first group of Steele's contemporaries, Otto Stark and James S. Adams, who had signed, people from Chicago. Bellman draws an entire picture of himself in bib overalls. And then he draws little pictures, aside from that, of a jacket and a tie, and he writes, "How will I ever put those back on after being here?" And he never did. He ended up not going back. He rented a place in town, and he didn't have a car. So he would kind of walk around town and sketch. And he produced a folio of woodcuts in 1910 called The Hills of Brown, and they really depicted places in town. And the newspaper had a Washington press, so when they were done with the paper, they would let him pull his prints on the Washington press. Eventually, he became friends with Steele. And Steele said, you need to come out with the artists. We're all painting. And so he would go out with them, and you begin to see his work change from being very illustrative to being very colorful. And you can even compare some Steele landscapes with some of Bellman's woodcuts and see a lot of similarities. They just become very rich, very detailed. And Steele invites him, suggests that he enter some of his work from the Hills of Brown and some other he had done since in the exhibition in San Francisco. And Steele was going to be a jurist. And so Bellman does, and there were thousands of entries, and he takes a gold medal. And so now he kind of finds himself on the forefront of printmaking in America, at least woodcut printmaking. And so he ends up back, in Brown County, and he experiments, and he does a lot of work. The story as to why he left there was another artist from Chicago named Lucy Hartrath. What was happening is a lot of artists from the Chicago area and other places would spend the summers in Brown County and then return home. So she was a summer visitor, and she was pretty attracted to Gus, and according to his sister, he left because it was getting a little too intense. He spent about 7 or 8 years there. He went out to the East Coast for a while and painted, around in New York and in other places, Gloucester and so forth. But then ended up going out west, and that's where he remained and became a major, figure in the Santa Fe and really. But he always said he never really left Brown County. That's where he learned his craft there.
Yeah, no,
Brown County.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, well, when over Steele's fireplace, he carved a little phrase. I take my hat off to the beauty of the world. He carved that in the mantle of the fireplace in Steele's studio. And so the art gallery took a piece of wood from a big tree that had fallen at Steele's property. It was a 200-year-old oak tree, and we took a piece of it. We milled it and let it age, and then we carved that phrase in the same text. And so it hangs in the Bellman Gallery. It's kind of a tribute to their friendship.
Cool. So for the benefit of the people who probably don't know, they're trying to imagine this. Brown County in Indiana had in its own become a destination for tourists in the sense that, when I grew up in Indiana, it was everybody went down to Brown County to see the fall color because the scenery is so beautiful. You literally have mountains, which you don't have in a lot of places in Indiana, but people would come there from all around the region, as far away as Chicago or certainly Indianapolis, which isn't far away, and come there and vacation. So that's why the appeal to artists, right? Just because it's beauty.
Yeah, that was certainly a lot of it. The glacier stopped actually right before it got to Brown County, so it didn't get leveled off. And then the fact that it had been so heavily timbered. All the beautiful trees with the leaves that people go to see are really second growth forests. And so you had these big, long views. It was very cheap to live there. And so it really was the artists who came. There was a writer named Ken Hubbard who wrote a cartoon called Bloom County, and he had a character named Abe Martin, kind of a philosopher. And he was running in the newspapers in the early 1900s, making a lot of political satire. And so people were kind of aware of him, and people in Chicago knew that was Brown County that he was talking about. But it was really the artists who kind of stuck their nose into it. And once people began to see the artwork that was being produced, and everybody wanted to come, and the merchants began to realize, well, gosh, we could rent cabins and build boarding houses and places to stay. But I think it was really more a little bit later that the tourism caught on because of the difficulty of getting from Helmsburg to town. So it was really this kind of dedicated core of artists. But by the 1920s, now you do have cars and people who can drive there and places to stay. And you had Frank Hohenberger, who was a photographer who located there and began writing a column for the Indianapolis Star called Down in the Hills of Brown, and his photographs sold all over the country. So he's depicting, this scenery in a very, readily available method. And so, one thing sort of led to the next. The formation of the state park in the early 1920s was another big draw. You had a lodge now and more places for people to stay.
Now, I have not been through the area for many years, but I'm curious about, has it maintained that charm that these artists saw back at that time? Because if you look at another artist colony like Carmel, for instance, even though a lot of the old bungalow houses that the artists lived in are still in Carmel, in some ways Carmel has lost some of its charm because it's become so touristy. What's the story in Brown County?
Well, there's probably two sides to that story. Sure, there's 200 shops, and there's hotels, and there's bed and breakfasts. But a lot of the shops are in the old houses that were there. They're probably the difference between Carmel and Brown County is Brown County wasn't. I mean, there's very few grand homes there. You know, they were all small homes. Some of the wealthy people maybe had a nice Victorian house, but the log cabins are scattered throughout the county and in the park. And those are actually, I think, more interesting in many ways than, you know, what's in town. There were people who came in and, you know, developers sort of at the time that built a lot of shops. They would rent them. You know, somebody would retire and they had some little crafts that they made and they would come there and try to make a living at it in retirement and found out eventually they couldn't afford the rent. But there seems to be a turnover now and you see much more higher end kinds of shops that are quality and a lot of craft guilds and really fine artists, you know, glass makers, but people who are really, really trained. You have several art galleries and you have a lot of music. There's, you know, we have a new 2,000 seat music center, which is, you know, a different kind of attraction. But the park is still there. It's become a mountain biking place. So you kind of get outdoor activities, you get art, and yeah, you got a couple of T-shirt shops in there for sure.
If I'm an artist though, and I'm going to the park, and I want to paint these, you know, lovely old shacks and so on, are they still there?
Oh, yeah. The park actually was built, a lot of the buildings that you're talking about were through the Roosevelt's New Deal and the Conservation Corps. They gave jobs during the Depression to artists to paint and to the Conservation Corps to build all the log shelters. They built the lodge. All those buildings remain. So there's a real tie. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt came to the gallery in 1934 to follow up on her husband's progress and bought several paintings.
So I have two questions for you. One is when Brown County was at its height in terms of artistic influences, people coming into the area, was it attracting people who were already artists and already trained, or was there an influence of people like Steele that were training artists that ended up with so many artists in the area?
By and large, most of the people of the early colony, I mentioned Adolf and Ada Schultz, trained at the Art Institute, trained in Paris. Marie Goth, Art Students League, V.J. Cariani, Art Students League, Carl Graff, Art Students League, Cincinnati Art School, L.O. Griffith, Houston, George LeChance, St. Louis, and many of them had studied in Europe as well, Glenn Cooper Henshaw, Paris, and member of the Paris Salon. So most of them had been trained elsewhere and were coming there looking for their Giverny. They wanted that bucolic, beautiful place where they had great subject matter, where it was inexpensive to live, yet they could get to a market. They could get to Chicago, they could get to Louisville, they could get to Cincinnati. In Chicago in the 1920s, a group of women formed the Hoosier Salon, And they began bringing artists from Brown County up to a show, a salon show. Often it was held at Marshall Fields or in different areas around the city. And it was a very prestigious show. And so that it gave a big exposure to the Brown County artists, and by 1926, they had formed an art association and their own gallery, and so they were going up there for that show up and through the 40s when it moved to Indianapolis, and still continues today. But there's a lot of Brown County art in Chicago as a result of those exhibits up there.
Well, I'm curious about, you mentioned a number of names of women, and your book is filled with features of women. We don't hear a lot about women painting in that era. There were obviously some that are very famous that painted in Paris, but talk to me about the reason there were so many women painting in this particular colony.
Well, I don't know if I would say there were that many. At least initially there was Ada Walter Schultz, Adolf's wife, and they as a couple, after they became friends with Steele, really founded that colony and began talking to other artists about moving there. And Ada founded the library and just tried to elevate the community, bringing culture and things in as well as painting. So she was there and actively painting. And then you had Marie Goff, who was a portrait painter. And World War I kind of sent her home to Indianapolis, where she continued that work. And she visited in Brown County and liked it and ended up staying there, and brought her friend V.J. Cariani and her sister Genevieve Gothgraft, who later, she'd kind of set aside her painting career to support her sister working as a teacher. But most of the other, Lucy Hartranft is a pretty well-known American Impressionist. She came in the summers, but she didn't commit to living there. And then Leota Loop is another that comes to mind. But all of these artists, Schultz in particular, would teach during the summer. So, hundreds of people would, there could easily be 200 artists painting in Brown County in the summer.
So people were holding essentially workshops. Right,
exactly. And it was like a cool thing to do, to get away from the heat of the city and rent yourself a cabin. And there were a number of industrial types, the Wilkses and the Murphys and others that really supported these artists. It wasn't easy. They weren't making a lot of money, and so some were more successful than others. But and a lot of them, I don't know, they were kind of, when they got there, a little bit in sort of a midlife crisis. They were in their 40s and 50s and had worked in commercial settings and were really interested in trying, to really focus on art and fine art. And, some of them had wives, some of them didn't. A lot of them didn't have children. So it was a really very intense kind of experience, I think, for a lot of them.
So in terms of what can be learned from what you discovered about the creation of this art colony, is something like that even possible today?
Boy, I don't think so, because I think it's the isolation of the place is really what allowed them to really focus and experiment and fight with each other and love each other. And Gustav Bellman kind of described it, somebody asked him about Indiana, and he said Indiana was a place where you had time to think. And I think that was important, but now with all the intrusions of the internet and social media and people, and I think it would be really difficult. And all those things are necessary if you want to have a market. But, and where are the patrons, that supported these artists, that paid to send Steele to study in Germany, and who, supported these artists through the Depression. And where are those people there? I don't think they're there, like they used to be.
Now, what about the contemporary art scene in Brown County? What's going on there now?
Well, Indiana actually is blessed with a lot of really fine artists. And the Brown County Art Gallery, which still exists today, along with the Brown County Art Guild, which split off from the gallery in the 50s, are home to a lot of really good artists. We have, in the art gallery, in addition to a historic collection, we have about 60 living artists who exhibit there. And many of them are members of the Brown County Artists Association, which, as I said, dates back to 1926. But others are members of another group called Indiana Heritage Arts, which stages a large Midwest art competition for people with a tie to Indiana. And they give out about $30,000 in prize money every year, and then when you add in what sells, it becomes a really lucrative thing for an artist to be a part of. The judges come from all over the country. And as a result, Indiana artists get a lot of support. We bring in professionals at the art gallery to provide, professional education. We really, we are constantly doing events and things that support them, and that's really kind of spread statewide. There's a paint out about every weekend somewhere in a community, or a guild, or an organization somewhere. So there is not, I can't say that anybody's getting rich off of it. There are some who are very successful professionally, but,
that's not
whoever
really the
did
point
really.
Anyway, is it?
No, it isn't the point. And the art gallery, because of its legacy and the history of PleinAir, and certainly we have studio painters as well, that tends to be the editorial position of the IHA show and of who exhibits in the building. If you come in as an abstract artist, you're probably not going to do as well because it's not what people come there to see. Our history is so well known. Although we are doing an abstract show in March in conjunction with Indiana University. We did one last year just to kind of, show, try to educate people a little bit on that there really was a foundation in representational art that led to this. So,
yeah. So in terms of stories and so on, I remember seeing in your book there was a mobile art studio that one of the artists had put together. Dahlgren? Maybe?
Charles Dahlgren. Yeah, he was one of the summer visitors. And so he had a van that he would just drive from place to place, and he could stay in that van. Carl Graf, when he first came, would pitch tents. They couldn't afford, or couldn't find any place available to stay. But then, eventually about 35 artists actually called it home, had homes there, and, studios. And we know where most of them are, and in fact, there is one lane that we occasionally do studio tours on, where a number of them live. And in town, all of the buildings that are shops do have a demarcation that show that this was someone's studio. But when I wrote my book, I came at it I was not an art expert in terms of a technical, person at all. I came strictly at it as a writer who actually had written for television for a lot of years. So to me, it was a great storybook with some really nice pictures. And so it was the stories of the artists that I think people are attracted to, the romance between Marie Goff and Vijay Cariani and I don't know, there's just a lot of stories about how they got there and what it was like to live there, and how the local residents resented them quite a bit. All these rich people, they considered, well, they were rich compared to most of them, coming there and, painting a picture of their cow. They thought it was nonsense. They couldn't believe anybody would spend time doing that. and so just that whole interaction of the community, and then how the community kind of figured out, hey, this could end up being, a way of an economic driver, and continues to be today.
Are there any specific stories that come to mind which might be kind of a way to cap this? Anything that any of the artists that you want to share that perhaps would be worth hearing?
Oh, they were all such different characters. Probably one of the most interesting and probably one of the most talented artists was Will Vaughter, and he was completely self-taught. He grew up in Greenfield, Indiana, which was also the home of James Whitcomb Riley, Indiana's poet laureate and eventually America's poet laureate. And Riley began to realize that Vaughter had some drawing skills, and Vaughter ended up illustrating many of Riley's poetry books. And he kind of ended up in Brown County, and he was well paid, for doing those. And so he really began to teach himself to paint with oils completely on his own. And when he moved to Brown County, he began working Brown County people into these drawings that ended up in these books. And part of what we have in our collection are some of Vaughter's original sketches, and as they appear in the Riley books. But he was a total character. He married this woman who literally came down there to marry him. She had heard of him. She knew of James Whitcomb Riley, and met Vaughter in Indianapolis when he was working on some sketches with Riley, and she followed him to Brown County, and she made Vaughter's life miserable, just totally miserable. They ended up getting divorced. And Vaughter lived above a store, and he had a wood stove in the house, and he would just dump the ashes out on the floor. He wouldn't really carry them out. And he would, when he would drive his car up to a location that he was going to paint, and he wouldn't necessarily get out of the car. He would just set the easel up on the steering wheel and kind of lay it out, and then he would wipe the brushes off on the ceiling of the car.
Sounds like he's kind of lazy.
So eventually everybody got so worried about him, they had him introduced to the widow of the person who owned the drugstore. And they finally got married, and she gave Will a proper home eventually. So, and he went to see, he was so enamored with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs when it played at the theater. He went to see it 8 times. He couldn't believe that characters like he drew for Riley could come alive and be on a screen, and just really interesting, lovely people.
He had incredible energy in his work. So I'm sitting here flipping through your book. I didn't know if you knew I had it. That may have been why I decided to do the podcast. I don't remember, but the I don't know if I bought the book in Brown County or I bought it on Amazon or something, but it's just a delightful book. It's a coffee table book. It looks like it's about 230 pages, 220 pages. Lots of beautiful color reproductions. Is it even in print anymore, or can it even be found?
It's actually in its 4th printing.
Really?
It came out, the last one came out in July, and it's in soft cover. And so, you can buy it on Amazon or IU Press, it was a real popular book. I think because we worked really hard to make it a good story. There's a chapter on each artist, and so it tells a little bit about them, and like C. Curry Bowman, his red hair and his temper, and the romance between Marie and Carrie Annie, and they never married. It was just this. Yet he was dedicated to her all her life, and E.K. Williams, who looked like Theodore Roosevelt and went actually enjoy, or Teddy, Theodore, and he wore a tie and bow tie when he went out and painted because he loved that people made that connection. There's just, and then Steele himself. So lots of really interesting stories that.
So you talked about Brown County becoming the Giverny of sorts. Would Steele have been considered the Monet of that that colony? Was he kind of the leader of the pack?
Absolutely. He was the rock star who came there first. And interestingly enough, there is a couple that donated $1 million to the Indiana State Museum, which matched it. And there is a beautiful visitor center now at the Steel site. And it's been, the house has been renovated, the studio has been relighted. They have put back Steele's outbuildings, and the couple's whole inspiration for doing this was visiting Monet's home and in Giverny, and they felt that the Steele site could be, that level of place, and it is. It's absolutely a stunner. You need to go back and see it because it's not what you remember.
No, I remember, actually, going into Steele's house, and you walk in the front door, and it was just pretty much like going into any other house, except it was his place. I don't remember if there were a lot of paintings in it or not. It seems to me I remember there were not a lot of his, but I may be wrong. But sounds wonderful. Well, this has been absolutely delightful. I'd encourage everybody to consider this book. It's called The Artist of Brown County. Lynn Letsinger-Miller is our guest today and the author. And Lynn, it's a pleasure for me to meet you and to talk to you because this book is one of my favorites. And of course, not only because I grew up in Indiana, quite frankly, growing up in Indiana, I had no idea about the Brown County painters. I knew about Brown County. It was not until I got into the art business, started publishing the magazines, that I discovered that there were all these magnificent painters in Indiana. So, and as you say, to this day, there's some fabulous painters in Indiana. I'm surprised at how many and the level of quality that is coming out of there. So, it probably had a lot to do with the early influences of Brown County.
Well, for sure, and I would also want to recommend the Brown County Art Gallery, which started in a storefront in 1926, and a fire chased it up the road, and it burned again. And then in the 1960s, a building, about a 7,000 square foot building, was put together. Now, thanks to the efforts of a lot of people who love early Brown County art, 5 years ago we added 8,000 square feet.
Oh my!
We have the Stevens Art Education Studio, which is a beautiful studio with a garage floor surface with ventilation that changes the air out every 15 minutes, that has its own kitchen and bathroom and huge exhibition walls and lighting for workshops specifically. And then the rest is all exhibition space, and we have the Indiana Years, Gustav Bellman, a gallery dedicated just to him, and a beautiful collection of all his works. We have almost every one that had been produced in Indiana. And then we have the William Zimmerman Studio, a very famous bird artist from Indiana, kind of a modern-day Audubon. And if you're a birder, we have birders. It's like a sanctuary. They come there, and we have all his original works there. And we have, a permanent collection room and, about 600 early Indiana pieces that we exhibit on a rotating basis. So people can spend 2 or 3 hours. We have videos you can watch that tell you the history of the county, and there's something going on all the time. We've learned that if you tell people the story and the history, they want to come and learn that and appreciate it, and sometimes they'll buy a painting, which is really special for our artists. The connection on the people who love Brown County, they really find it at that gallery. We've had people walk in and say, "Oh, I remember seeing that when I was a girl," or So there's it's a real romantic, beautiful place to spend some time.
So here's what I'm going to do. No promises, but each year in the fall I do an event called the Publishers Invitational, where I bring a group of usually about 100 artists, and we take over a hotel or a resort or a college or something, and we just come and paint the area for a week, and we sit around at night and we sing songs and talk to each other and show each other our paintings. And so I am going to see what I can find in Brown County, and no promises, but maybe if I can find something, I'll do one in Brown County in a year or two.
I would be more than happy to help you with that. We have workshops coming from all over the country that have that same idea, maybe not quite to that size, but we can certainly accommodate it, and would love to see that happen.
Well, Lynn, thank you so much for being on the PleinAir Podcast. I hope everybody enjoyed it, got some sense of an area. I'm going to be doing a series on some of the colonies around the country, so if you happen to be part of one of those, let me know, and maybe we can do something on the history of your colonies as well. But starting out, maybe because of my upbringing in Indiana, but we're starting out with Brown County, but it's not just because of that. It's because of the significance in the art world and how much influence. And I talked to a significant art dealer who deals in, the Edgar Paynes of the world from Laguna and otherwise. And he said to me that the most difficult and most sought after paintings for him to find are Brown County paintings.
Well, we could certainly help him out with that.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you again, Lynn, for being on the PleinAir Podcast. Again, the book is The Artist of Brown County, and it's Lynn Letsinger-Miller. Thanks again, Lynn.
Thank you. I love talking about Brown County. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thank you again to Lynn Letsinger-Miller. I am more excited about Brown County than ever, and maybe we'll do a trip there. I'm already going to look into it. And anyway, if you think you might want to go on a trip there, drop me a note. If I get a lot of interest, then maybe we'll do it. Also, I've got a bunch of marketing ideas for you. Are you ready?
This is the Marketing Minute with Eric Rhodes, author of the #1 Amazon bestseller, Make More Money Selling Your Art, Proven Techniques to Turn Your Passion into Profit.
In the Art Marketing Minute, I try to answer your art marketing questions from from things you send in. Email your questions to eric@artmarketing.com. Here's a question from Carolyn Hancock. It doesn't say where Carolyn is from, but she says, Eric, I'd love to get your feedback on writing an exhibition proposal. I've created a body of work that should be exhibited as a whole for the full impact. What is the best way to interest today's galleries or museums or nonprofits? Thanks for all you do for supporting artists. Well, Carolyn, I got to tell you, I'm not big on writing proposals. I have spent so much of my life writing proposals and having them rejected and not having them even read in some cases that I decided I'm just not doing proposals anymore. I think it's a big, giant waste of time. Now, there are certain environments where proposals are necessary. Like if you're doing proposals for a grant or something, absolutely got to do it. It all seems very formal to me, but I like to think that we tend to hide behind email and proposals and PDFs and things like that. The reality is that if you want to get something done, it's best to either get face-to-face or phone-to-phone. Let me explain why. Let's imagine for a second that you're a busy gallery or museum director. You get hundreds of emails a week. Everybody's asking you the same question. Everybody wants to be in your gallery. Gallery owners tell me they get 1,500, 2,000 unsolicited artists who are reaching out every week or every month to try to get into their gallery. Well, you don't want to do what everybody else is doing. You want to be different. And so if you're busy, I was with a gallery director. We were having a meeting, and while we were doing meeting, he was opening up, glancing in, and throwing things in the garbage. And I said, what is that? He said, artist proposals people have sent. He said, and I get 150 emails a day. He said, if I spent all my time doing this, I'd never get anything else done. So to them, it's important, but they have other things they have to do too. So if you're busy and you have to sort through things, or you have your assistant, if you have one, sort through things, well, what's left is about 2% to get their attention. If you open your own email and your goal is to get through it fast, you're looking for certain keywords or clues so you can hit delete fast, right? I get dozens of proposals every month. I get proposals for articles. I don't hit delete in those cases. I just forward them to my editors because I don't make those decisions. They do. It's up to them. and I get proposals for tech stuff. Sometimes I forward it, sometimes I delete it. So I get probably dozens of people every month say, we want to do SEO for you, or we want to build websites for you. I already know we have that covered, so I just hit delete. I don't even respond. I can't possibly respond to everybody. I'm not trying to be a jerk, but these are people who are coming unsolicited. If I know somebody, I'm always going to respond. Anyway, people are looking for ways to eliminate work, and so if you're one of the many proposals coming in the door, chances are they're not going to read it, or if they read it, they're going to read the first headline, and if the headline doesn't grab their attention, they're gone. So I scan things that come through. So guess what never happens, though? Nobody ever calls me. It's very rare. Once in a while, people will call, email and ask for an appointment. Once in a while, somebody will call, and sometimes I give appointments to people that way, but it's got to pique my interest. You got to get my attention. You got to get their attention. And if not, you're not going to get an appointment. Now, I'm not trying to sound difficult. It's just that there's a lot going on, and I can't do it all. So you got to kind of pick and choose. So what you say in your email or your headline or your subject line has to pique interest. If you are going to do a proposal, you need something in that top headline and that proposal that's going to sound exciting and get them interested. And it shouldn't be about you, it should be about them. In other words, what is this going to do for me? This is going to draw crowds. This is going to get a lot of attention. This is going to get national publicity. Look at what it's going to do for them. Always shift this to what's in it for them, or what's in it for me, right? So don't make things about you, make things about them. If you can get a meeting, then you can sell yourself on your idea, and you can overcome objections when they come up. I was in a meeting the other day, and somebody brought up a couple of objections. I said, I'm glad you mentioned that, because here's why that's not a problem. And then they went, oh, yeah, okay. But you can't do that when they're reading a proposal, and most people are not going to give you the time and attention to call you and ask you those questions. They're just going to move on. So tailor your presentation to people's needs, too. So you want to start by asking them, what are they looking for? What are their needs? If you're doing gallery shows, what kind of shows are you looking for? What do you want them to accomplish? And then when you're doing your proposal, you can say, well, you mentioned that you really need something that's going to generate a lot of publicity. Here's why this is going to generate a lot of publicity. See, that's how it works. Selling yourself in person is the best way. You don't have to take any sales courses. You just have to be yourself and be willing to tell people what's on your mind, but always listen first. Remember, you got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use 2 ears and listen. Stop and listen, and then adjust your course as you go. And of course, if you know someone who will introduce you in, you've got an 80% chance of increasing the likelihood of getting a meeting. So I hope this all helps. The next question came up in our Figurative Art Convention marketing sessions. It says the question is about how and why to build your list. Well, what would your life be like if you owned your own media? Let's say you're me. Let's say you own Fine Art Connoisseur magazine and PleinAir magazine and Realism Today and American Watercolor and Fine Art Today and PleinAir Today, or the PleinAir Convention or the Figurative Art Convention, or the video companies that Streamline and Lilidol and Creative Catalyst. All of those are platforms, and they're opportunities to promote. So if you could advertise in your own media for free, it's a real benefit, right? Well, I can do that. Other people pay a lot of money to be in my media, but I can advertise my own stuff for free because it's my company promoting my company, right? So what if you could do that? Well, building a list is like having your own media. When you have a mail list, an email list, and by the way, both are a good idea, you can email them or mail them as much as you want. Of course, you want to be respectful. You don't want to overmail. You want to be careful about that. You want to make sure they've opted in to receive things, but you can do anything you want. So now you can email things like new painting announcements, workshop announcements, newsletters, and things like that, whereas you could still buy advertising, and you still should buy advertising, but this is a way to expand on it. So I like to say, look for everything you do to drive one particular initiative, and that's building your list. I try to do that very much. On your website, you should have something that makes them join your list. On your social media, talk about it. You should have business cards that talk about it. You should have it on the signature or the bottom of your email talks about it. On your, everything that you do. Talk about build my list. Well, the way to do that is to create an incentive product. Let's say you want to do the 20 best paintings you've ever done or 25 best paintings. You can say, I've got an ebook of the 25 best paintings I've ever done and the stories behind them. Takes you 10 minutes to create it, make a nice cover, put it on your website. They click on it, it says, free, just enter your email address. Now you have the ability to email them and talk to them. And this is the way to build customers for whatever it is you're doing. And if you want something very specific, build an ebook that's specific to that. So if you wanted something for painters and something different for collectors, have a different subject for each. And the collectors will go with the one subject, the painters will go with the other. Of course, we're finding today a lot of collectors are learning to paint, so you might get them to do both. Anyway, I hope that helps, but having your own media is a beautiful thing. So if you can do that, that's a great thing. And the nice thing about email is that you can control it a little bit more, right? You can mail it. Now, there are things called open rates, and so if you get like a 18 or 15% open rate, that's considered pretty good. Not everybody's going to open every email. And so, that's, social media, only 2% of the people on your news feed ever see what you've put out there. Only 2%. So if you've got 10,000 people, you're getting to, 200 people. And we all think that everybody sees everything, but it's just not true. So this is something you can control a little bit more. Now, you've got to have, speaking of headlines and subject lines, you got to have powerful headlines and subject lines on your email subject and on your headline, because if those don't draw people in, then nobody's going to pay attention to it. So you've got some homework to do. Anyway, I hope that's been helpful. I want to remind you that I'll be doing art marketing 3 mornings live at the upcoming PleinAir convention and also the upcoming Figurative Art convention. It's kind of fun to do live because we can interact and you can ask your questions, so come and join us. Anyway, that is today's Art Marketing Minute.
This has been the Marketing Minute with Eric Rhodes. You can learn more at artmarketing.com.
A reminder to enter your paintings in the PleinAir Salon by March 15th. Also to check out the FACE conference at figurativeartconvention.com and the art trip to Vienna and Berlin from Fine Art Connoisseur at finearttrip.com. Also, if you've not seen my blog on Sunday mornings where I talk about art and philosophy and so on, it's called Sunday Coffee. It can be yours for free if you go to coffeewitheric.com and sign up. coffeewitheric.com. Well, it's been fun doing this. We'll do it again sometime, hopefully next week if I can get to it. I will still be here in Russia. So I will see you when I see you. Watch my Facebook and Instagram. I'm posting pictures of what's going on. And if you're not on there, my Instagram is Eric Rhodes, RHOADS, Eric Rhodes, and my Facebook is the same. And Facebook, I'm at my friend max of 5,000 because I want to keep it a personal page, but you can still follow it. And that way you'll get the feeds. I just can't see what you're doing, which is unfortunate, but that's kind of the way Facebook makes it. But if you do that, I'm posting things on Instagram and Facebook, and you're going to want to see the pictures of me painting out in the cold weather. So that's kind of fun. And I'll have pictures of some of the interviews and things that I'm doing as well, and have posted several so far. Anyway, this is fun. We'll do it again. And I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of PleinAir magazine. Remember, it's a big world out there. I'm out in that big world as we speak, painting it. You go paint it too. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
This has been the PleinAir Podcast with PleinAir Magazine's Eric Rhodes. You can help spread the word about plein air painting by sharing this podcast with your friends. And you can leave a review or subscribe on iTunes so it comes to you every week. And you can even reach Eric by email, eric@pleinairmagazine.com. Be sure to pick up our free ebook, 240 plein air painting tips by some of America's top painters. It's free at pleinairtips.com. Tune in next week for more great interviews. Thanks for listening.